I'm Jay Keevy, CBF's Director of Ministerial Transitions and our Abuse Prevention and Response Advocate, and I am happy to welcome you today to our conversation about trauma-informed ministry. I'm joined today by my friend Leanne Gardner. She is an ordained Baptist minister. She is the Associate Director of Field Education for the online program for the Garland School of Social Work out of Baylor. And she is a licensed clinical social worker in a private mental health practice too. So Leanne, welcome. That's a long list of things that you do. We're glad you could join us.
Thank you.
So when we think of trauma-informed ministry, we're talking about how churches and clergy and ministers in other contexts address and care for folks who have experienced trauma in their, have brought experiences of trauma into their settings, and how we can serve and care for them well. So let me start by offering a definition of trauma so that we're all kind of playing on the same page. And then Leanne, you can help us understand how our brains and bodies process that trauma. So I'm using a definition of trauma from Resmaa Menacem's excellent book, My Grandmother's Hands. So he says, contrary to what many people believe, trauma is not primarily an emotional response. Trauma always happens in the body. It's a spontaneous protective mechanism used by the body to stop or thwart further or future potential damage. Trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It's a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Trauma is also not an event. Trauma is the body's protective response to an event or series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. This perception may be accurate, inaccurate, or entirely imaginary. In the aftermath of highly stressful or traumatic situations, our soul nerve, that's what he calls the vagus nerve, and our lizard brain, so that's the sort of instinctual deep part of our brain, may embed a reflexive trauma response in our bodies. So, Leanne, help us unpack first, what trauma does in our brains.
So I love this definition because we often hear the response to trauma in the body and brain as negative. And it's really important that we understand that our bodies and brains are really trying to adapt and protect, but it's sort of an overcorrection that has a whole nother set of unintended consequences. So I like to think about, people used to explain when I was in school learning about this, we would talk about, our cave people days when we were constantly having to protect ourselves from encroaching enemies that would eat us for their dinner. And so, or potentially eat us for their dinner. And so we had this sort of fight, flight, freeze response, and always on the lookout. And we operated really kind of low down on in our brainstem, the primal lizard brain that he talks about. And as we have developed and grown over, thousands and thousands of years, we still have that fight, flight, freeze, of course, because it protects. But people who experience trauma, that impulse is sort of there's an over response there. So when we think about the brain sending us emergency signals, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem. When somebody has been through a traumatic event or has experienced trauma, not just an event, but maybe a series of events, their brain is over responding to things that may not be dangerous. And so it's a protective piece to say, hey, we're going to do whatever we can to protect you. So that brain piece, with somebody who has experienced trauma or who has post-traumatic stress disorder, is their brain is constantly or almost constantly in that fight, flight, and freeze mode. Our ACEs study that I'm sure you'll talk about shows us that being in that state consistently is not good for our health. It's not good for our long-term outcomes. But again, I always just kind of want to say, that is our body and brain doing its job in protection. But we have to sort of pull it back and say, okay, is this an event or a thing that warrants this type of response, or do I need to include some or start doing some kind of self regulation activities? I'm kind of jumping all over the place, so I'll stop there for the next question.
Yeah, that's great. So when fight, flight, freeze sort of takes over our brain functioning, it changes how we process the world and memory. So can you say a little bit about sort of how our brain functions differently when it gets into that fight, flight, freeze mode?
Yeah, so the best way to describe that is to talk about what happens when we're not in fight, flight, freeze mode. And that's the first graphic that we're going to show you, the brain process under typical conditions. And so when we are not aroused in a way that is trying to protect ourselves, we can have information come in, we can observe it, we can have input of it, we can interpret it, we can process it, we can evaluate, we can plan, and we can act. And you hear in all those words that we're moving up the brainstem when we do that. So if we think about the brain, the primal part of the brain being at the bottom, this is very simplified, by the way, and we're moving up to our more sophisticated functions that are really what make us human. The ability to analyze, to step back, to take a breather, to see different sides of a situation, to assess, to figure out what we're going to do next, to use critical thought, to analyze. That's what, as kids, we grow up to adults to be able to do that, hopefully. And that would be like a typical pathway and process to processing information. So what happens when we are having to fight that bear constantly in the woods, whether it's imaginary or real, that typical path gets short circuited into fight, or freeze. So we skip, the alarm system's triggered. So the alarm system says, hey, we don't have time to do all this analysis and higher level thinking. We need to protect ourselves. And I'll say it again. That is our body and brain's way of saying we want to live, we want to survive, and that is a good thing, but not when it is not necessary. So those are out of proportion responses to the threat that takes us away from that long, reasonable path in short circuits. So when repeated stress happens, when we are exposed, we see this with kids who grew up with chronic stress. They appear to have a lot of behavioral problems in school. Often it's labeled ADHD, but what we learn is it is a trauma response because the fight, flight, freeze is triggered very easily to self-protect. And so the express route then becomes the main road, and we do not take our time. Our brain does not take its time to assess and evaluate because it's protecting itself. It's saying everything is a threat. That creates a ton of cortisol, a ton of energy, which has its own set of consequences that I mentioned earlier. So our whole bodies and brains are really sort of jumping to conclusions, as you will, and then and sort of taking the shortcut to protect.
And so when our brains kick in to this defensive mode, they send the messages to the rest of our body that slows down digestion, speeds up breathing, speeds up heart rate, muscles clench, vision focuses. We get into the sort of either ready to engage or flee or be overwhelmed sort of body mode. And so it sounds like, the combination of things that happen in brain and body, and maybe the things that work well to protect us in danger don't necessarily work well under, less serious circumstances or sort of the regular moments of life. So can you say a word just kind of about how either we come stuck in the trauma response, or how, when we're triggered, that affects our behavior?
Yeah, so I think, as usual, the best description of this is a story. And one of the things I remember before I knew all this trauma education, brain body connection, I worked in child protective services and foster care. And I now look back on a lot of my experiences with kids with this new lens and think, oh, that's what was happening. But at the moment, I did not know what was happening. I had a foster child who was 8 years old, who had been abused by her stepfather. And one day we went into a chicken, like a Kentucky Fried Chicken or some kind of chicken place, and she fell apart. Like, all of a sudden, there was a major tantrum, screaming, crying. I had no idea what was happening. We, of course, left, and the car is the best place to talk to kids, by the way, because they're in the back seat and they're not staring at your eyes. And it was a long ride home, and what I learned from her is that her stepdad took her to Kentucky Fried Chicken. Mm-hmm. So her body, the smell, the place, the environment, her sensory intake immediately triggered a trauma response. And hers was fight, get me out of here. Other kids would have completely shut down, not talked to me. I wouldn't have known what happened. Different people respond different ways. And so that is an example of how the body and the mind sort of work together in this. So she was down in her lizard brain because she could not say to me, hey, I am having a very strong reaction to the smell of chicken. She could not articulate that. She was 8, and also because it bypassed her brain. Her body understood what her brain could not understand. And so that was interesting to me. I tucked it away, but like I said, I didn't really understand the connections until later. And we heard those stories over and over again about different things, different sensory things, really, being taken in by the body and experienced as triggers. And I use triggers very intentionally because it's overused. That word is overused. And this is in the truest sense, a trigger, where it was a reminder of an event or a trauma, and it sparked a reaction that a person cannot control.
Well, since you mentioned therapy, one last question. So for people who have experienced trauma, for people who sort of find themselves rehearsing that their survivor, they're working to feel and do better and working toward health. What are some of the pathways toward that health, either with therapy or with support, or just say a word about the pathway out of that sort of perpetual trauma response?
Yeah. So first, I would say, because I'm a clinician and that's my bias, is to find a trauma trained therapist. Not all therapists are the same. And so somebody who specializes in understanding this brain body connection. The best book that I know of and that I've heard many survivors talk about being helpful is The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk. And he talks about other things like acupuncture and yoga. One of the things I have read a lot about that I think is interesting is talk therapy is helpful. Another model is EMDR, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, because it uses it goes beyond words. It uses, what trauma does is disintegrate us, and so we get stuck. And EMDR's approach is we have to reintegrate the different parts of the brain, and that has also been helpful. But I think too, I have heard people say getting in their bodies in a way that is loving and compassionate, like yoga. Even yoga, so not talk therapy, but yoga, body practices, meditation, where you are reintegrating and learning to be in your own skin in a way that is healing and transformational. I've heard a lot of people say that that's helpful. So I like him because he doesn't just say like talk therapy is the only way to do it. I am married to somebody who would never benefit from talk therapy, which really helps me as a clinician to, instead of saying like everybody needs and benefits from talk therapy. It's just not true. But I do think there is a lot of evidence to say we have to replace the body's response to trauma with something that is healing, restorative, and meditative, whatever that might be for a person. And just like there's a lot of different kinds of people, there's a lot of different kinds, there's a lot of different paths to healing. And I think people have to there's no cookie cutter. And so people have to figure out, and a therapist is a good way to start, to say, hey, have you tried these other body practices?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially if they're trained in trauma and are open to other non-traditional ways of doing that.
That's so good. Thank you, Leanne, so much for joining us in this important conversation. It's going to continue over time, I'm sure. You mentioned a couple of things, the ACE study, Bessel van der Kolk. We'll be sure to include those and links in our resources that will accompany this conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We're continuing our conversation about trauma, turning now toward addressing trauma in ministry settings. I'm joined today by Kendra Plating and by Kevin Pronato, who will introduce themselves. Kendra?
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I'm happy to be part of this discussion. I'm Reverend Kendra Plating, and I serve at First Baptist in Greenville, South Carolina. And I kind of got interested in trauma in divinity school and actually ended up writing my final paper, my project paper on trauma and storytelling, and didn't quite realize how much it would serve me in the ministry setting, because now I do pastoral counseling one-on-one or small groups with people. And I'm always amazed and saddened by how many times trauma is a part of someone's story. As I start hearing about their life and hearing what's brought them to where they are today. So it's really served me well to be aware of the way trauma affects our body and our spirit and our mind and our connection to others.
My name is Kevin Pronato. I serve as the executive director for Mission Oak Cliff at Cliff Temple Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. And my history is actually, I'm also a licensed social worker as well as an ordained minister. So every day I encounter people who experience various kinds of trauma, some more chronic than others. And so everything that we do at Mission Oak Cliff in order to serve our greater community is in a trauma-informed manner and in a way that provides dignity and hope to really vulnerable populations. So it's really great to be here.
Thank you both so much for being a part of this conversation. So when you hear the phrase trauma-informed ministry, what does that mean for you? You know, what's your particular approach toward trauma-informed ministry?
For me, sure. Yeah. For me, it's looking and working with people in a holistic way, working with people and seeing them as a whole person, their whole history, their whole emotions, just everything that they're coming with, and trying to work with that in order to help them grow, flourish, thrive in the ways that they want. So especially when working not only with our clients, but also with the volunteers that we have at Mission Oak Cliff and the other people who we interact with on a day-to-day basis, we try to see them as a whole person and make space for everything that they're going through. So even with the staff that I work with, they don't always come with smiles on their face and with roses and sunshine, but they too are experiencing trauma. I have staff members who are going through cancer right now. I have staff members who have had to transition to become primary caretakers for family members who have gone through a major car accident and divorce, different things like that. And how do I minister to them as a whole person, not just seeing them as employees, but also seeing them for the humans that they are and the lives that they're living in right now and the context that they're in. That's really important, I think. And for us to make space and to provide grace when needed is especially important.
Thanks.
Yeah. When I think of trauma-informed ministry, what it means to me is that as a minister, serving in a parish setting, that I know enough about what trauma is and how prevalent it is and the way that it affects someone to see them as a whole person, kind of what Kevin was saying, to realize the effects that trauma can have on people's lives. And one of the things that's really important for me too, as a minister, is to realize kind of where my expertise ends in how much I know about trauma. And that's okay. Like, I'm here to accompany them spiritually and support them spiritually. And to know that there's probably a certain point where I'm not going to be able to support their mental health or their physical health in the same way that another professional will. So what's really important for me is to kind of know where my expertise ends and to know what other resources exist in my community. People who are better trained than I am to take care of them medically, to take care of their mental health, to take care of them physically, to give them safe spaces in all kinds of ways. So that's something that's really important to me too, is for me as a minister to remember I'm here to support them spiritually. And that means a lot. And that's a big amount of support. That's a big way to support someone. But also I can't be everything to them, everything that they need.
I think a lot of times when we think of trauma, we tend to think first maybe about people who have been abused in some way. And so, Kevin, I'm so glad that you mentioned, a surgery or a car accident or, these other things that can elicit a trauma response from us and that can, help us feel unsafe in lots of different kinds of circumstances. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I think for me, when I think of trauma-informed ministry, one of the things that comes to mind is, early in my ministry when I encountered people whose behavior may have been affected by prior trauma, that their trauma response may cause them to act out or to act in ways that were, not as typical or acceptable. I'd sometimes think, what's wrong with this person, right? That they're acting this way, or that they're having this particular struggle, or that, they cry every time we sing this particular hymn, or whatever it is, right? What's wrong with this person? And being trauma informed has led me to what I think is a better question. What happened to them that might lead to this? What's happened in their life, which is much more compassionate, I think. Can you think of things in your ministry or in your theology or in your approach to scripture that has changed as you've become more trauma informed in your ministry?
I think you can almost read the whole Bible as a story of trauma to people. I mean, really, like when you start looking for instances of trauma in the Bible, you see it everywhere. You see it across the Hebrew scriptures, across the Old Testament, people being in exile, war happening, famine happening, murder. There's all kinds of trauma that happens to individuals and to groups of people in the Old Testament. And then I think when you move into the New Testament, you see Jesus encountering people as whole beings, healing people. And I think a lot of the times, these are the people who Jesus is healing maybe they've been traumatized by what they've been through, by an injury they have, or by being ostracized from their culture. For different things. And I think you're exactly right, Jay. When you start asking, what happened to them instead of what's wrong with them, that's the way Jesus encountered these people, I believe. What is your story? What brought you to where you are right now? And what's going to help you have hope and healing in the future?
Yeah, I think my approach to scripture has completely changed over the past, 3 years, 4 years, and just being able to see the Bible more as that story that Kendra said, and reading the narratives and trying to humanize the Bible characters that we often elevate, as our heroes and sheroes, and we just put them on pedestals and don't see the humanity in them oftentimes. But these people have gone through so much trauma, and trying to look at just the whole arc of the narrative, and the resilience of the people in Scripture is really encouraging. And in the way that I work with people as well, sometimes we see trauma as a deficiency that someone has, or just a lack of, and instead shifting that narrative to seeing the resilience and the strength that people have in their day-to-day life in order to overcome. I think that's just a powerful motivator to continue pressing on into that trauma-informed ministry in our lives.
Those are really great observations. And part of what comes to mind for me is, you talked about ministry with whole persons, and addressing the whole life of people in your care. It's an incarnational way to serve in ministry. It takes the whole body as, a spiritual person, and not just trying to address, something called a spiritual part. And so I think that's a theological transformation that came, or let me rephrase that. A trauma-informed ministry helps me practice a more incarnational faith, seeing people, both body and spirit, a whole soul, kind of in the Hebrew sense. So that's a welcome sort of improvement of my theology and practice of ministry through the years. As you think about trauma-informed ministry in your settings, in a ministry center or in a congregation, how has the church or the center itself, as it's learned better how to be more trauma-informed, what's changed about church ministry? What's changed about how you engage clients who come into Mission Oak Cliff?
For us, we started asking more questions and become better listeners. We rarely provide answers. And I think that that's important to give space for people to share their own story, and to be the experts of their own story, instead of prescribing just easy answers and kind of a lucky charm kind of God to people. And being able to just sit with the mess and be uncomfortable in that situation also provides some level of comfort and hope for people who are going through hardships. The power of presence is so powerful, and allowing people to struggle and wrestle with God. I think we oftentimes just want to have an easy fix and to jump to the next thing, but to give space for people to just sit and be, and walk with them through their grief and through their journey of discovery, I think is meaningful, and provides just a space for God to move ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's helped our church, and I don't think we're a judgmental church at all, but I think it's helped us be even less judgmental to people who walk in the door. To know that trauma can make people act differently, and that's okay. That it's also something that's very treatable, if they have community, if they have support, if they have love. That trauma is so many times just what disconnects people from others, and the church just being community to people is healing. the power of being community after a traumatic experience, or if somebody's been through multiple traumas, just the power of having community. I love what you said, Kevin, about just listening more and asking more questions instead of giving some ready-made response to people. I think that's what I've gotten better at in my own ministry over the years, is just listening. Like, there is also power in the act of someone telling their story, like giving someone space to think through what's happened to them and how do the pieces fit together? How do the pieces not make sense? But just to give someone space, non-judgmental, calm space to do that is a part of healing trauma. Giving people easy answers in no way helps to heal trauma. It's empowering folks to realize their own resilience, their own strength, what they've already done to survive for so long. The power of listening and asking more questions and giving community to folks. And I'll also say too, that one of the things that I notice can really stop folks themselves from talking about the trauma they've been through is shame. Shame is a really big part of this conversation for me. It stops people from asking for help, and it stops people from even realizing sometimes what's happened to them because they've never talked about it with someone else. And shame is what lets that continue, just hiding things. So being the kind of church that admires truth telling over hiding a part of who we are, that God honors the truth, and when we tell it, God walks with us in what comes next. That's been really, really helpful for me to realize just how much shame is a part of people's story when they've been through something traumatic, and to say, God honors you telling the truth.
I wonder what advice you would give to congregations or individuals who are interested in adopting a more trauma-informed approach in their setting. What do you consider some of the important first steps, or just what advice generally?
Yeah, I would kind of point to a few books as kind of a starting point. I know that you and Leanne have already talked about one, which is a wonderful resource. And the other book that I would really recommend to people is Judith Herman, and her book is Trauma and Recovery. And that was my first book that I ever read about trauma. And it says a lot about storytelling, and I think how we can be a good partner to people who are telling their story of trauma. I'd also just say be aware of the good resources in your community. In Greenville, South Carolina, we have the Julie Valentine Center, which is a nonprofit that specializes in supporting people who have been through trauma. Know about the domestic violence shelters that are in your area. Know about the mental health services in your area. Do trainings like the ones that you offer, Jay, to make your church a safer place for everyone who participates. How to recognize abuse, how to stop abuse before it even starts. Those are all really, really important pieces, I think, for churches kind of giving knowledge to themselves.
I would also just add how it starts with us, and for us to be aware of our own traumas that we've experienced and to process through that first. For us to, if we need counseling, to seek out the counseling and the therapy that we need in our own lives, because our own mental well-being is important and is worth the recognition, and we need to go through that process ourselves before we help other people. And then, as Kendra said, there are so many trainings out there on trauma-informed care. And there are so many places that offer continuing education units surrounding this. And just a simple Google search in your area would yield plenty of results, I'm sure. And then also, I think, to just start the conversation within the congregation, for people to be aware that trauma, everyone experiences trauma, and for us to be able to identify trauma as a congregation and to start speaking the language is a big first step. I'd love to see that happen even within my own church. So those are some of the things that I can think of.
There'll be a list of resources that accompanies this video, so we'll be sure to get those on there. And of course, yes, I am very happy to help train or bring resources to congregations across CBF and beyond. My contact information will be a part of the resource list as well. I wonder if for either of y'all, there are one or two practices that you've adopted in your settings to help sort of send the messages of safety to people who may be experiencing trauma. How have you changed how you interact just from, the moment you meet folks in the church setting or in Mission Oak Cliff?
Yeah, one of the big ones that we adopted at Mission Oak Cliff is to call everyone by name. Just recognizing and acknowledging someone's name makes people feel seen and known. And that has made a huge difference at our agency. People feel so valued when we call them by name. And when we remember their name, especially. So as much as we have issues with our memory sometimes, but for us to really be intentional about trying to remember people's names has made a big difference. And then also to the way that we just don't assume, like, for example, there was this one time when this lady came to our doors and it appeared as if she was pregnant, but she had actually just miscarried a baby 2-3 days ago. And one of the learning experiences for us was we, just assumed that she was pregnant and was happy for a baby, but it was a source of grief and pain for her at that moment. And that was not very trauma informed, the way that we just jumped to conclusions. So instead now, we ask, we allow the client to give agency to share their own story instead of interjecting ourselves into their story. We never know what they're going through, what their source of pain, what their source of grief is in that moment. And so as much as possible, we try to give agency to the clients that we have to be the owners of their life experiences.
One of the things that the staff at our church has done recently is to go through mental health first aid training, which kind of helps you know how to deal with someone if they're in a mental health crisis. And I think this is just another practice that we've done to try to be less judgmental about if people are presenting in a way that seems strange to us, what could be causing that. So that's been a really good resource for our staff to kind of go through that training, the mental health first aid training. One of the other things that we've done recently is we have a program here at our church that every person who volunteers with children or youth has to go through a background check and an educational segment about recognizing abuse and stopping abuse. And we call this program Protecting Our Children. And what we realized recently was that the videos that we're using to do this education can actually be triggering to people who have been through trauma. They can actually be triggering for people who have been abused, especially in the church setting. And so we've said now, when we send out this email information for people who are trying to complete Protecting Our Children, we put a disclaimer on that, a trigger warning. To say if you have been through abuse, if you have been through trauma, these videos could be triggering for you. So instead of watching these videos, talk to Kendra. or talk to Julie, talk to one of the ministers. We can give you the information that you need in a different avenue than watching these videos. And I was really proud of us for recognizing that and recognizing the need to say, this could be something that would not serve you well if you've been abused or traumatized.
Thank you. Those are all really great observations and recommendations. One of the things that comes to mind for me is really trying to cultivate a culture of consent in a congregation. We often assume that everybody who comes through the door wants a hug or even a handshake. And one of the things we've learned in the midst of COVID is, handshakes don't have to be automatic. Hugs don't have to be automatic. And so for some folks who have suffered trauma, just unwanted touch or surprising touch can be very, hurtful to them, right? So creating opportunities to give consent before those kinds of things happen, and from children on up, don't require that of anybody. Kendra, Kevin, thank you so much for your time with us today, for your perspectives on trauma-informed ministry, for sharing those resources. I and CBF are available to help you and your congregation become safer and more trauma-informed. We'll see you at church.